In the heart of London, gas lamps flickered against the misted streets, casting a fragile glow that seemed to retreat from the looming facades of townhouses. Inside one such home, behind lace curtains that shielded the domestic world from the restless city beyond, the life of a Victorian lady unfolded with meticulous precision. Morning routines were rehearsed with mechanical grace, each gesture a testament to propriety, the careful arrangement of hairpins, the crisp folding of gloves, the gentle, deliberate sip of tea. Yet beneath this veneer of order, a quiet unease pulsed. The women of society moved through a world constricted by expectation, a cage gilded in silk and polite conversation, their days bound by endless parlors, embroidery circles, and the meticulous judgment of peers. Margaret Winthrop, daughter of a retired naval officer, was a creature of habit and obedience. Her mornings were filled with the soft rustle of skirts across polished floors, afternoons with calls from friends and distant relatives, and evenings steeped in the languid music of pianoforte recitals. To outsiders, she was the very image of refinement and composure. But behind the calm of her gray eyes lay a restless hunger, a yearning for something more, though she could not name it. It was a hunger shared quietly among many women, whispered only when confidences were trusted, and shutters were closed against the gaze of a society that prized restraint above all. The introduction of new remedies and elixirs was common enough, often arriving from the east or distant continents, packaged with the promise of health, beauty, or relief from ailments both physical and emotional. The latest arrival, a pale tincture rumored to brighten the complexion, steady nerves, and sharpen the mind, carried with it a curiosity that was difficult to resist. Gentlemen spoke of it in hushed admiration, noting its subtle effects on temperament. But it was the ladies who, drawn to novelty and the faint thrill of defiance, were first to embrace it. Margaret received her vial from a distant cousin who had returned from travels abroad, the delicate glass bottle gleaming in the candlelight. Its contents shimmered like liquid pearl, a small promise of escape from the monotony that pressed against the walls of her well-appointed home. It began with small indulgences. A drop in her tea before luncheon, a whisper of the substance mixed into her evening tincture, nothing enough to provoke scandal, nothing enough to claim attention. Yet Margaret noticed changes that she could scarcely articulate. Her dreams became vivid and strange, nightscapes where the rigid rules of her waking life were bent and twisted, faces she knew well transformed into shadows, houses stretched impossibly tall, and the suffocating walls of etiquette melted into the freedom of corridors lit only by starlight. During the day she felt a lightness, a surge of energy that pushed against the weight of her society-bound duties. She laughed more freely, spoke with an unfamiliar sharpness, and found herself drawn to the clandestine corners of her home, where she might indulge thoughts previously deemed improper. Other women whispered of similar experiences, always with a caution that bordered on terror. Mrs. Ellsworth, a friend from the drawing-room circle, confided that she often felt invisible, as though slipping through the cracks of reality itself after a modest dose. Lady Beatrice, younger and wilder, spoke of visions that made her shiver in delight and horror in equal measure. There was a pattern, though no one dared name it aloud. The elixir, at first a mere curiosity, a socially acceptable indulgence, was altering the minds of those who took it, peeling back layers of civility and exposing the fragile psyche beneath the corset and lace. Margaret found herself torn between fascination and fear. The strictures of her upbringing and the pervasive judgment of society weighed upon her, yet the allure of the drug whispered of freedom and transcendence. Each drop carried a promise, a fleeting escape from the mechanical repetition of daily life, a glimpse beyond the boundaries that dictated the posture of a lady, the angle of her gaze, the very cadence of her speech. In the quiet of her private chamber, she experimented cautiously at first, noting the subtle lift in mood, the fleeting sense of empowerment. And yet, with every indulgence, a shadow crept across her perception, a whisper of something dark, a trembling at the edges of her mind, as though unseen hands were guiding her along a path she was not meant to follow. Even as London thrummed, outside, bustling with commerce, politics, and the ceaseless march of modernity, An invisible current moved through the upper echelons of society. It was not made of wealth or influence, not of marriages arranged or balls attended, but of the pale tincture that passed from hand to hand, a subtle contagion with promises of transformation. The women who partook felt the thrill of clandestine rebellion, a departure from expectation, but they also felt the first stirrings of something more sinister. Shadows lengthened in their visions. Voices whispered in corners of rooms where no one else stood. The lace curtains fluttered in a wind that came from nowhere, and behind them, the women moved through a new kind of society, one that existed only in the liminal space between propriety and indulgence, between reality and the haunting possibilities of the mind set free by a drug that would soon change their lives irrevocably. As Margaret traced the delicate patterns of lace with her fingertip, she felt an uncanny presence, a suggestion that the world she knew was shifting. Each tick of the mantel clock became a drumbeat in a ceremony she did not understand, leading her deeper into fascination, deeper into fear. Outside, the city carried on, ignorant of the invisible epidemic taking root in the gilded parlors and sunlit drawing rooms of the elite. And so, behind the lace curtains, the first whispers of a haunting began to stir, faint as a sigh, elusive as smoke, yet inevitable in their reach. Victorian women, poised and proper by day, were on the cusp of transformation, and the world would soon come to know the shadowed consequences of their quiet indulgence. The city of London had always been a crossroads of commerce and curiosity, but in the spring of 1873, a subtle shift began to ripple through the drawing rooms and salons of the elite. It arrived not with the clamor of newspapers or the brash spectacle of public announcements, but quietly, wrapped in fine glass vials and carried by travelers from the East. Merchants spoke in half-whispered tones of a new elixir, its origin exotic and mysterious, its effects said to be both restorative and intoxicating. Some claimed it soothed nerves, brightened the complexion, and sharpened the intellect. Others hinted at visions beyond the ordinary world, a freedom from the rigid structures that dictated the lives of women in polite society. Curiosity alone was enough to stir the interest of the ladies who lived behind lace curtains, their days regimented, their desires constrained, their dreams mostly confined to the polite fantasies deemed acceptable by convention. Margaret Winthrop, still cautious yet increasingly captivated by the promise of escape, was among the first to receive word of the substance. A visiting cousin, returned from distant travels in India and China, brought with her the mysterious tincture. The small vial gleamed in candlelight, its contents a pale, iridescent liquid that seemed to capture the faint glow of the room itself. Her cousin, with a conspiratorial smile, spoke of its virtues in hushed tones, emphasizing its rarity and the discretion with which it must be administered. The very secrecy of it lent the elixir an allure beyond its promised effects, casting the mundane routines of daily life into stark relief against the tantalizing possibilities of indulgence. Word spread rapidly, though always in whispers, from one parlor to another. The ladies of society, bound by etiquette yet drawn to novelty, began to experiment with small doses, mixing the tincture into tea, syrups, or even perfumed water. It was a slow invasion, subtle and silent, but its effects were unmistakable. Women found themselves lighter in spirit, their minds unburdened from the relentless pressure of propriety. Conversations became livelier, laughter freer, and even the most cautious of women felt a thrill in the clandestine act of indulgence. It was, they told each other, a harmless escape, a small rebellion against the suffocating demands of dress, decorum, and daily expectation. But the drug did not merely ease the burdens of social constraint. It opened doors to sensations previously unknown. The first signs were almost imperceptible. A lingering sense of disconnection from the mundane, a heightened awareness of the self, a lightness that made ordinary rooms feel impossibly vast. Margaret experienced them in fleeting moments. An afternoon spent staring out a rain-speckled window, a brief trance during which the familiar patterns of wallpaper seemed to ripple and shift as though the house itself were breathing. It was intoxicating, terrifying, and exhilarating all at once. She found herself compelled to experiment more deliberately, to test the boundaries of the drug's influence, even as she sensed the first tremors of its more insidious effects. As the weeks passed, the presence of the elixir expanded beyond individual households. It began to appear at private gatherings, discreetly placed on silver trays alongside teacups, offered with a polite insistence that masked its true potency. The ladies who partook often did so with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, aware of the forbidden nature of the indulgence yet unable to resist. In the safety of familiar company, they could share stories of visions and altered perceptions, yet even these shared tales could not convey the depth of the transformation taking root within them. For some, the elixir brought a sense of empowerment. For others, it was a siren call that would gradually erode the boundaries between reality and the shadowed realms of imagination. Men noticed the change as well, though often too late to intervene. Gentlemen visiting for tea or supper observed the uncharacteristic vivacity in their wives, sisters, or acquaintances. A lady's laughter might carry an unfamiliar edge, her gaze linger longer than propriety dictated, her words hinting at thoughts she would never have dared to express before. Some men regarded these changes with amusement, others with unease, yet none could fully grasp the subtle transformation sweeping through the upper echelons of Victorian society. The elixir moved quietly, almost invisibly, through the corridors of privilege, leaving in its wake a trail of curiosity, obsession, and subtle unrest. The allure of the drug was compounded by the secrecy that surrounded it. In a society where public scrutiny was relentless, the ability to indulge privately, without judgment, was irresistible. Women who once felt confined to rigid routines discovered a sense of autonomy, however fleeting, within the clandestine ritual of consumption. Even the most disciplined found themselves drawn into the addictive rhythm, a sip in the morning, a drop at lunch, a lingering taste after dinner, and with each dose came a heightened perception of the world, an ability to see patterns, colors, and emotions that had been invisible before. Rooms seemed more vibrant, conversations more layered, and the self more expansive than the narrow confines of daily expectation allowed. Yet, beneath the surface of this seductive escape, shadows began to stir. Some ladies reported feelings of disorientation, episodes of sudden fatigue, or inexplicable tremors. Others spoke in veiled terms of shadows flitting at the edges of vision, whispers in empty rooms, and a sense of being observed by invisible eyes. Margaret, increasingly enthralled by the drug, felt these disturbances keenly. The initial exhilaration was tempered by a quiet dread, a recognition that the elixir's power extended beyond the pleasures it offered. Even as she reveled in the expanded boundaries of her perception, she could sense the faint pull of something darker, an undertow beneath the sparkling surface of the drug's allure. And so, the arrival of the elixir marked the beginning of a subtle, inexorable transformation. It was not dramatic at first, and few outside the intimate circles of its users suspected its potency. But the ladies who partook were stepping onto a path from which there was no simple return. The world behind the lace curtains had expanded in ways that promised freedom and pleasure, yet hinted at haunting consequences. Margaret, like so many others, found herself caught between the intoxicating thrill of exploration and the creeping realization that the drug's reach was far greater than anyone had imagined. London's elite were awakening to a new temptation, one that would soon leave its mark not just on the minds of women, but on the very fabric of Victorian society itself. The city's gentlemen were often the first to notice subtle changes, though they rarely understood them fully. In London's elite circles, where men measured status by wealth, breeding, and political influence, the behaviors of women were considered indicators of propriety and virtue. But in the spring and early summer of that year, a peculiar unease settled over the salons and tea rooms. Gentlemen who attended these gatherings began remarking on the sudden brightness of certain ladies' eyes, their restless gestures, and the unusual cadence of their laughter. At first, these changes were amusing, an enlivening twist on otherwise staid social routines, but amusement soon gave way to suspicion as patterns emerged that could not be ignored. Sir Thomas Aldridge, a well-connected banker with a keen eye for social nuance, was among the first to articulate what many had sensed but dared not name. It is as though they are not entirely themselves, he remarked over lunch with a circle of acquaintances. One speaks, and there is a vivacity, an energy that seems almost borrowed. And yet there is something else, something fleetingly hollow. His companions nodded, intrigued yet hesitant to confront what they felt but could not explain. Within these whispered assessments, a silent acknowledgment passed. The women were changing, and no one could determine why. The gentleman's curiosity was fueled by more than social observation. There was a personal stake in understanding these transformations. Wives, sisters, and cousins who had once been predictable in temperament now displayed a restless autonomy that unsettled their male counterparts. Letters began to arrive at offices and clubs describing unexpected moods, vanishing hours, and late-night absences. Some women spoke of appointments with obscure physicians or travelers who had returned from foreign lands with curatives of uncertain origin. Sir Thomas and his peers shared theories cautiously, speculating on everything from nerve disorders to the influence of exotic imports, yet none could pinpoint a cause. The whispers grew louder, hinting at scandal, but evidence remained frustratingly elusive. Among the most perplexing reports were the accounts of fleeting absences or lapses in awareness. Ladies who had been present in drawing rooms would sometimes appear distracted, their gaze fixed on some distant point invisible to others. Conversations would falter as their attention drifted, and when pressed, they offered only vague excuses, fatigue, nerves, or sudden illness. Gentlemen observed these behaviors with a mixture of concern and fascination. It was a phenomenon without precedent, one that challenged the strict norms of observation and control that had governed Victorian households for generations. At the Aldridge estate, Thomas's sister, Eleanor, exhibited these very symptoms. A careful, obedient daughter who had never shown an inclination toward extravagance, Eleanor had recently begun spending hours in her private chambers with her writing desk and small collection of imported remedies. Thomas noticed a certain sparkle in her eyes when she spoke, a liveliness that was both thrilling and unsettling. He watched as she sketched patterns of abstract shapes and symbols in her notebooks, her hand moving with a fluidity he had never seen. When he questioned her, she offered only vague reassurances, claiming that she was exploring new ideas. But even as she smiled, there lingered in her expression a distance he could not bridge, a subtle detachment from the familiar world they shared. The gentleman also began to notice an unsettling pattern of behavior in public settings. At the opera, ladies would rise or move abruptly, seemingly compelled by invisible forces, or gaze through balconies with an intensity that made onlookers uncomfortable. The once stable social order was under threat, though no one had yet drawn a direct line from these behaviors to the mysterious elixir circulating in the elite circles. Rumors and speculation multiplied. Could the women be ill? Were they under some psychological strain? Or was it, as some suggested with cautious humor, simply the restless energy of youth and privilege? The truth, however, was far stranger than any theory they could devise. Sir Thomas, intrigued and increasingly alarmed, began discreet inquiries. He spoke with physicians and apothecaries, who were similarly puzzled, noting only that some women displayed heightened nervous energy and erratic sleep patterns. Others reported vivid dreams or periods of disorientation that coincided with the ingestion of certain imported remedies. Yet the medical explanations were insufficient. The phenomena extended beyond physical symptoms, touching upon perception, emotion, and cognition in ways that eluded conventional understanding. Even the most observant men could only record what they saw, noting changes in comportment and behavior, and wondering privately if they were witnessing the emergence of a new societal force entirely beyond their comprehension. Meanwhile, the ladies themselves remained divided in their awareness. Some reveled in the subtle defiance, the taste of freedom and heightened perception that the drug afforded them. Others, however, sensed the creeping influence of something more profound and disquieting. Margaret Winthrop, having spent months experimenting cautiously, recognized both exhilaration and fear in her own reflection. The visions that visited her were growing more vivid and insistent, yet she was not alone in this experience. Across London, drawing rooms echoed with whispers of similar disturbances, though each woman bore them privately, afraid to acknowledge the unnameable force reshaping her life. By late summer, the gentlemen's curiosity had evolved into anxiety. They could no longer dismiss the patterns, nor the subtle epidemic that was taking root in their households. The city's social calendar, once a stage for measured conversation and polite entertainment, had become a theater of subtle chaos, in which women moved according to invisible rhythms, guided by desires and impulses they did not fully understand. Even the most rigidly controlled households could not resist the pull of the elixir, and the men who observed these changes felt helpless, their authority diminished, their comprehension incomplete. In this uneasy climate, the stage was set for what would come next. The first vanishings, the slow unraveling of carefully constructed lives, and the emergence of a secret society of women bound together by curiosity, indulgence, and the haunting allure of a drug that promised both liberation and oblivion. The gentlemen, once arbiters of propriety and guardians of social order, found themselves cast in a role they could not master, observers of a transformation beyond their understanding, powerless to intervene as the shadows lengthened in the hearts and minds of the ladies they had long sought to control. The first disappearances were subtle, almost imperceptible, and London's social elite were slow to recognize their significance. A lady might miss a single evening engagement or fail to appear at a scheduled luncheon, and the explanation, when pressed, would always be plausible: illness, travel, or the demands of a private family matter. Yet, as weeks passed, the pattern grew undeniable. Women who had once been fixtures of society, familiar presences in drawing rooms, gardens, and opera boxes, vanished without warning or explanation, leaving behind perplexed families and whispered rumors that could not be entirely suppressed. Margaret Winthrop, observing the departures of acquaintances and friends, felt a mixture of fear and fascination. Her social circle, once orderly and predictable, now seemed precariously suspended between routine and chaos. Lady Beatrice, who had laughed freely in past weeks, failed to appear at her weekly card game. Mrs. Ellsworth was absent from church. Even the formidable matron, Lady Hawthorne, renowned for her ironclad adherence to social norms, was reported to have left London under the pretext of visiting relatives in the countryside. Each absence was accompanied by a trail of gossip, yet no definitive explanation emerged. The drug, still a whispered secret among the ladies, was beginning to leave its mark in the form of tangible disappearance. The vanishings were not immediate or dramatic. There were no violent scenes, no public outbursts. Instead, the effect was insidious. A woman might first retreat to her private chamber, appearing withdrawn and distracted for hours at a time. Then came the elongated periods of absence, punctuated by notes that were polite, brief, and vague, hinting at engagements beyond the comprehension of their peers. Some families assumed travel, others feared illness. But those who knew of the elixir suspected a different cause, a slow, deliberate withdrawal from a world that had suddenly become confining, suffocating, and intolerable in its demands for decorum. Margaret herself began to notice subtle changes in her own behavior, a growing compulsion to remain within her private chambers for longer stretches of the day, to avoid the polite but suffocating company of her peers. The elixir's influence deepened, moving beyond temporary exhilaration to something more profound. A shift in perception, a restructuring of priorities, a gradual detachment from the rigid social framework she had once accepted without question. She began to dream more vividly, the visions extending longer into her waking hours. Shadows of faces she recognized, but not quite, drifted across walls and ceilings, their features changing with the light. Whispered voices, soft and insistent, echoed in corners, speaking in tones that were neither threatening nor comforting, yet impossible to ignore. The social consequences were immediate, even if the families themselves were slow to acknowledge them. Luncheons and teas became marked by empty chairs and subdued conversation. Invitations were issued with hesitation, and hosts noted with increasing concern the absence of once reliable guests. Gossip, long a staple of Victorian society, became laced with fear. "She has gone mad," some whispered. "Illness has taken her," others suggested. Yet the truth, that the women were under the subtle dominion of a powerful drug, remained concealed, hidden beneath polite smiles and carefully measured words. As more women disappeared, the gentlemen of London grew restless. Sir Thomas Aldridge, observing the absence of Eleanor from his own household, felt a gnawing anxiety that he could neither quell nor articulate. Physicians consulted in secrecy, offered only partial explanations: nervous exhaustion, hysteria, or temporary psychosis, all plausible within the narrow medical understanding of the era. But even these assessments failed to account for the coordinated nature of the vanishings or the unmistakable pattern that connected them. The invisible hand guiding the women was subtle, deliberate, and relentless, and it left no trace that could be addressed through conventional means. Within the drawing rooms, the ladies themselves were divided. Some embraced the disappearances, finding liberation in the act of stepping away from expectation, in the freedom to explore inner landscapes that society had long denied them. Others hesitated, caught between the thrill of indulgence and the creeping dread of losing themselves entirely. Margaret oscillated between these extremes, compelled by curiosity, yet haunted by the increasing intensity of her visions and the insistent whispers that seemed to emerge from the very walls. Her reflection in the mirror appeared altered at times, her features slightly elongated, her eyes too bright, as though the drug had begun reshaping not only perception, but the self itself. Rumors began to spread among the remaining ladies, though always in whispers, always guarded. Secret gatherings were arranged in private homes, where the drug's effects could be discussed without fear of exposure. There, tales of vanished friends were shared with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Some spoke of transcendent experiences, of glimpses into worlds beyond London's grey streets and gaslit corridors. Others described terrifying visions, a sense of being pursued by intangible entities or of losing time entirely, awakening to find hours, or days, had passed unnoticed. These accounts were met with both skepticism and envy, yet no one could deny the changes that had overtaken the social landscape, and so the first vanishings marked a turning point. The delicate balance of Victorian society, carefully maintained through etiquette, propriety, and surveillance, began to tilt. The elixir, once a mere curiosity, had asserted a force that neither families nor authorities could contain. Women, drawn by curiosity, desire, or the promise of escape, were disappearing into private worlds that remained invisible to the rest of society. Margaret, now fully aware of the drug's transformative power, stood at the threshold of her own descent, the shadows lengthening around her as London continued its indifferent rhythms outside. The lace curtains no longer shielded the world beyond. They framed a realm where freedom, danger, and obsession intertwined, and where the line between life and disappearance had begun to blur irrevocably. By the autumn of that year, the phenomenon of disappearance had begun to consolidate into something more deliberate, more organized, though still hidden from public view. The vanished women, or those on the verge of retreating completely from societal expectations, began to communicate quietly, their connections forged in shared experience and secrecy. Margaret Winthrop found herself drawn to these clandestine circles, first through whispered recommendations, and then by invitation to discreet gatherings held in hidden rooms behind familiar facades. The air in these meetings was thick with anticipation and curiosity, scented faintly with imported incense and the ever-present traces of the drug that had become their conduit to altered perception. The members of this secret society were diverse in temperament and circumstance. Some were widows, escaping the rigid oversight of husbands. Some were daughters of wealthy families, suffocated by the weight of propriety. Others were simply curious, drawn to the strange allure of the elixir and the promise of experiencing life beyond the narrow corridors of their daily existence. What united them all was the recognition of an invisible chain, the realization that the lives they had been trained to lead were simultaneously gilded and constrictive, beautiful and imprisoning. Here, in the hushed intimacy of candlelit parlors and back rooms, they found a space in which their voices, their thoughts, and their impulses could breathe freely. Margaret was initially hesitant. She had been raised to obey, to conform, to place decorum above desire. Yet the society's allure was irresistible. Women spoke openly of visions that had come to them after small doses of the elixir, landscapes of impossible beauty, glimpses of past lives, moments of clarity in which the constraints of Victorian expectation seemed absurd and hollow. They shared strategies for maintaining appearances while slipping quietly into their private indulgences, advising one another on how to conceal the signs of withdrawal from the public eye. Secrets became currency, discretion a badge of honor. To be invited was to be acknowledged, and to be acknowledged was to accept a responsibility both intoxicating and terrifying. The gatherings followed an unspoken rhythm, beginning with shared consumption of the elixir, followed by conversation that ranged from the mundane to the philosophical, then sliding into experiences of hallucinatory intensity. Margaret discovered that her companion's visions were often interconnected, overlapping, in ways that suggested the drug was not merely an agent of personal transformation, but a medium through which shared consciousness could emerge. She felt herself drawn into patterns she had never imagined, seeing echoes of her friends' perceptions and sensing the edges of their thoughts, as though the elixir had forged invisible threads between them. Within these meetings, ideas flourished that would have been unthinkable in public society. Women speculated on the nature of consciousness, the limitations imposed by social expectation, and the potential for liberation beyond the boundaries of domestic life. The conversation occasionally touched on darker topics, the seductive pull of the drug, the terrifying visions that left some trembling for hours, and the fear that indulgence might lead to permanent detachment from the world. Yet, even these shadows were woven into the collective experience, acknowledged and discussed as part of the journey, rather than forbidden or feared. The society became, in essence, a sanctuary, a secret world parallel to the one in which their families and acquaintances remained oblivious. Margaret quickly rose in stature among the group, recognized for her perceptive nature and willingness to explore deeper, more challenging visions. She shared her own experiences of hallucination, the subtle dislocations of time and space, and the glimpses of otherworldly landscapes that had begun to populate her dreams. Others responded in kind, revealing their own fears, triumphs, and discoveries. Bonds formed rapidly, intensified by the shared ritual of the elixir, the mutual understanding of secrecy, and the thrill of existing outside the ordinary constraints of society. In this space, Margaret found herself simultaneously liberated and haunted, empowered and anxious. The society was not static. It evolved with the women who participated in it. Meetings became more elaborate, incorporating music, poetry, and symbolic gestures designed to heighten the effects of the elixir and synchronize their collective consciousness. A coded language of glances, gestures, and shared symbols emerged, allowing members to communicate subtle messages in public while maintaining the secrecy of their bond. In this hidden network, power and influence operated differently, not through wealth or marriage, but through insight, courage, and the ability to navigate the shifting landscapes of mind and perception that the drug opened. Yet even as the society grew, the first signs of strain appeared. Not all women could withstand the intensity of the experiences. Some withdrew quietly, their minds overwhelmed by visions or fear of permanent detachment. Others became possessive of the drug, hoarding vials or seeking to control the shared rituals. Tensions arose between curiosity and caution, liberation and obsession. Margaret recognized these fractures as natural consequences of a system that existed beyond conventional morality, beyond social structure, and beyond even the women's full understanding. The elixir had created a society within a society, one that was fragile, dynamic, and perilously dependent on secrecy. Outside their hidden world, life continued in its ordinary rhythm, but cracks began to show. Families noticed absences, whispers of illness grew more persistent, and the ever-watchful eyes of London society strained to comprehend changes they could not name. The secret society, thriving within these shadows, became a force quietly reshaping the lives of its members, providing both refuge and risk, empowerment and peril. Margaret, now fully initiated, understood that her world had expanded irrevocably. The boundaries of propriety, identity, and perception had shifted, and the path forward promised both extraordinary insight and the haunting possibility of irrevocable loss. The women of this society had discovered freedom, but it was freedom, tempered by the intoxicating, unpredictable, and dangerous influence of a drug that would haunt them, body and mind, for the months and years to come. As the nights lengthened and London's fog thickened, Margaret felt the first tremors of a deeper journey, one that would test loyalty, sanity, and the very essence of self, drawing her ever deeper into the shadows of the elixir's domain. By the late autumn, the ripple effects of the secret society and the drug's influence began to seep, almost imperceptibly, into the broader fabric of Victorian society. Drawing rooms that had once echoed only with polite chatter, piano melodies, and the gentle clinking of teacups now carried whispers, soft, indirect, but laden with speculation. Women who had not partaken in the elixir nonetheless sensed that something was shifting. A glance too long, a smile too knowing, a faint pallor in a friend's complexion sparked curiosity and concern. Rumors, as is their nature, traveled swiftly, twisting and mutating with each retelling until a story of a missing lady might become a tale of scandal, insanity, or even forbidden indulgence. Margaret Winthrop observed this social tremor with a mixture of anxiety and detached amusement. She had been part of the clandestine gatherings long enough to understand the invisible threads connecting her fellow participants. Yet the whispers outside their circle carried a potency of their own. She encountered them at luncheons and card games, in passing comments at church, and in letters that arrived with the careful politeness of societal convention masking something deeper. Some women spoke of the peculiar airs of their friends. Others confided vague fears of madness, addiction, or the moral failings of those who disappeared from polite society. The dialogue was indirect but insistent, a reflection of Victorian propriety's ability to cloak fear in elegance. The gentlemen, too, were unsettled. Sir Thomas Aldridge, among others, sensed that these hushed exchanges were more than idle gossip. The disappearances, he realized, were becoming an epidemic of perception. Not everyone had vanished physically, yet some ladies seemed absent in spirit, distracted, or otherwise altered in ways that drew attention and concern. At dinners and social events, men found themselves observing gestures and expressions that were unusual, even unsettling. A lady's laughter might carry a hidden edge, her eyes an unnatural gleam. Private glances exchanged across the room hinted at unspoken knowledge, creating a tension that could not be explained by fatigue or nerves alone. In these drawing rooms, the rumors acted as both catalyst and amplifier. Women began questioning their own behavior, scrutinizing each word, each motion, to determine whether they were, in some subtle way, participating in the unfolding mystery. The secret society, while invisible, had become an invisible presence within every gathering. Women who remained uninvolved noticed patterns, sudden absences, faint intoxication, or the peculiar attentiveness of certain peers who exchanged coded glances that suggested knowledge of experiences they could not articulate. The interplay of curiosity, envy, and fear created an atmosphere heavy with tension, as if the very walls of London's elite salons had absorbed the unease of the women within. Margaret herself became increasingly aware of the fine line between concealment and exposure. Every social event required careful performance. She had to maintain the outward appearance of composure, attentiveness, and propriety, while internally navigating the altered state induced by the elixir. Even the slightest misstep, a gesture too long, a smile too knowing, a glance exchanged with a fellow initiate, risked drawing scrutiny. Yet she was also beginning to sense the thrill of subtle influence, the capacity to move within this duality, with grace and precision. In many ways, the whispers in the drawing rooms became an additional layer of the secret world she inhabited, an unspoken acknowledgement of a reality that society had yet to name. These whispers also carried moral and philosophical undertones, reflecting the anxieties of an era in which women's roles were rigidly prescribed. Some critics within the social circles speculated openly, though politely, about the dangers of indulgence, the risk of moral corruption, or the decay of societal order. Others were more speculative, pondering whether these shifts signaled a deeper truth about consciousness, perception, and the hidden capabilities of the human mind. Margaret, attuned to both perspectives, recognized the duality. Society feared what it could not control, yet within the fear lay fascination, and within fascination lay the potential for even more women to seek the very experiences that were whispered about in hushed tones. As autumn deepened, so too did the shadows of secrecy and influence. The elixir's effects grew stronger, the visions more vivid, and the shared experiences of the society more compelling. Meanwhile, the whispers in the drawing rooms acted as both a warning and a lure. Some women, unable to resist curiosity, sought out their vanished friends or inquired discreetly about the secret gatherings, driven by a mixture of longing and apprehension. Others recoiled, frightened by the notion that what was happening could touch them personally, that the boundaries of propriety, reason, and reality were subtly shifting in ways they could neither comprehend nor resist. Margaret found herself increasingly caught between these worlds: the ordinary society of tea, lace, and etiquette, and the extraordinary society of vision, indulgence, and spectral presence. The whispers carried a dual function. They concealed and revealed, they warned and tempted. And in this delicate balance, the first real fractures of Victorian order began to appear. Women who had not vanished physically now seemed to exist, in multiple planes of awareness, shifting imperceptibly between the expectations of society and the demands of the elixir. Conversations became layered, gestures encoded with meaning, and laughter both genuine and performative. The world behind the lace curtains was no longer simply a stage for polite interaction. It had become a theater of shadows, anticipation, and quiet dread. By the time winter arrived, the whispers had grown into a symphony of suggestion, echoing through London's elite salons and parlors. Margaret understood, with a mixture of pride and apprehension, that the secret society had become not just a refuge but a force shaping the perceptions of the broader social world. The drug's influence had extended beyond individual experience, reaching into collective consciousness and the social rituals that had long maintained the delicate balance of Victorian order. And though the true extent of its reach remained invisible, the subtle tremors it generated hinted at a coming upheaval, one that would challenge not only personal identities but the very structures of a society that had long believed itself immutable. Dr. Jonathan Halloway was a physician of considerable reputation in London, known for his meticulous observations and the precise detail with which he chronicled the health and habits of the city's elite. He had long maintained a private journal, recording illnesses, treatments, and subtle shifts in behavior that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. It was through this lens of scrutiny and careful note-taking that he first became aware of the strange affliction touching the women of society, a pattern that was subtle, insidious, and deeply unsettling. At first, the cases appeared sporadic. Ladies arrived at his consulting rooms exhibiting mild fatigue, faint tremors of the hands, and intermittent episodes of absent-mindedness. They spoke of vivid dreams and occasional hallucinations, but dismissed these experiences as overwork or nerves. Halloway recorded each detail with his characteristic diligence, noting the timing, frequency, and severity of symptoms. As the weeks progressed, he began to discern patterns that could not be attributed to ordinary illness. The women who exhibited these behaviors were generally of similar social standing, often interconnected through family ties or social circles, and almost always had access to imported remedies or elixirs that promised relaxation, beauty, or mental clarity. Halloway's first entries were cautious, factual, and clinical. Patient reports intermittent disorientation, sleep disrupted, visions described as vivid yet indistinct. No physical signs of disease, family attributes symptoms to nervous fatigue. Yet, as cases accumulated, he could not ignore the recurrence of shared experiences, visions of landscapes impossible to describe, hallucinations in which time seemed distorted, and a compulsion to isolate themselves from ordinary social interaction. The doctor's notes, once purely medical, began to take on a tone of unease, symptoms escalating, patient increasingly withdrawn, reports of perceptual distortions, visions overlapping with those described by acquaintances, cause undetermined. It was during one particularly troubling consultation that Halloway began to suspect the influence of the mysterious elixir circulating among society's elite. Margaret Winthrop herself had arrived at his office under the pretext of a routine checkup. Though her hands trembled with the faint residue of the drug, and her eyes held a light that was almost unnatural, she spoke cautiously, describing episodes of vivid hallucination, an altered perception of space and time, and the sense of being connected to others through intangible threads. Halloway, recording every word with growing alarm, realized that these were not isolated phenomena, but part of a broader, coordinated pattern of altered cognition. The doctor's journal became both a repository of observations and a chronicle of creeping dread. He documented not only the symptoms, but also the social and psychological implications. Patients' families report absenteeism, altered behavior, and emotional volatility. Social repercussions considerable. Etiquette and propriety challenged. Rumors of secret gatherings circulating, though unconfirmed. Influence of external substances suspected. Each entry reflected his growing concern that this was not a medical anomaly, but a societal one, a disruption that extended beyond the individual body to affect perception, behavior, and relationships within the upper echelons of London. Halloway also began experimenting cautiously, attempting to trace the substance's source and understand its chemical composition. He noted its opalescent quality, its bitter sweetness, and the faint floral aroma that seemed to linger on the skin and in the air after ingestion. Preliminary observations suggested that the elixir was far more potent than ordinary tonics or sedatives, capable of inducing profound alterations in consciousness without immediate physiological damage. The doctor theorized that the drug's effect on the brain was subtle but cumulative, producing states that were simultaneously euphoric and disorienting, heightening perception while loosening the bonds of social constraint. Yet even as Halloway pursued his inquiries, he faced obstacles common to the era: secrecy, propriety, and denial. Women who partook of the elixir were reluctant to admit their experiences, fearful of censure or scandal. Families, too, preferred explanations grounded in illness or nervous temperament, rather than confronting the possibility of substance-induced transformation. Halloway's notes grew increasingly detailed, almost obsessive, as he attempted to map the progression of symptoms, the networks of influence, and the subtle social effects rippling through drawing rooms, parlors, and salons. By winter, his journal contained entries that bordered on the extraordinary. Patients report shared visions, coordination of perception with others, and an inability to distinguish between objective reality and hallucinatory experience. Psychological dependence observed. Family concern mounting. Influence of substance appears primary. Societal implications profound. In private, Halloway wrote of the creeping horror he felt, of women who seemed to be drifting toward a state of permanent detachment, their minds ensnared by a force invisible to all but the most careful observer. Margaret's visits continued, each more revealing than the last. She confided details of the secret society, the elaborate rituals, and the shared experiences that bound the women together. Halloway recorded every account with professional detachment, though privately he feared the social catastrophe that could arise should the truth become widely known. The drug, he understood, was not merely a curiosity or a medical anomaly. It was a force with the capacity to upend both individual minds and the very structure of Victorian society. The doctor's journal became a silent witness to the unfolding crisis. Its pages, filled with precise observations, reflected both the intellectual rigor of a meticulous physician and the growing recognition of a phenomenon that defied conventional understanding. Halloway's notes would later serve as a crucial record, capturing the early stages of a haunting epidemic, the subtle dislocations of perception, and the ways in which a seemingly innocuous elixir could alter the lives of women who had once moved through society with predictable grace and propriety. As Margaret departed each session, leaving behind the faint scent of the elixir and an aura of otherworldliness, Halloway could not shake the certainty that this was only the beginning. The ladies of London were on a trajectory from intrigue to obsession, from curiosity to dependence, and the city's social framework, so rigidly maintained, was increasingly vulnerable to the quiet but relentless power of the drug. In the margins of his journal, he wrote the words that would haunt him as surely as the women themselves. The substance does not merely change the mind, it alters the soul, and once touched, there is no return. By the following spring, the effects of the elixir had begun to penetrate the most intimate corners of London society. What had once been a secret indulgence now intertwined with desire, obsession, and human frailty, altering not only perception, but the delicate fabric of relationships. Margaret Winthrop, whose curiosity had carried her to the heart of the secret society, found that the drug did more than expand her mind. It magnified every emotion, every longing, and every hidden grievance. Affections intensified, rivalries sharpened, and the line between devotion and possession blurred, leaving a trail of heartbreak and betrayal in its wake. Love, once predictable and structured by etiquette and social expectation, became volatile. Gentlemen, unaware of the depth of the drug's influence, found themselves drawn to women whose charm had become sharper, whose presence was more intoxicating than any courtship could produce. Yet the very same women, under the drug's subtle guidance, found themselves enthralled not by convention or status, but by the fleeting intensity of sensation, the allure of forbidden perception, and the exhilaration of clandestine experience. Courting rituals collapsed into improvisation. Engagements once carefully negotiated became unpredictable, governed by desire rather than propriety. Margaret herself noticed a stirring within, a mixture of fascination for a young artist she had met at a private gathering and a simultaneously growing suspicion of his intentions. The elixir had sharpened her intuition even as it clouded her. Judgment betrayal, too, emerged with cruel precision. The secret society, a sanctuary for women, became a stage for jealousy, manipulation, and secret liaisons. Some members exploited the shared rituals to gain influence over others, offering the drug selectively, withholding participation, or subtly undermining rivals. Friendships fractured as the effects of the elixir intensified. Visions became compulsions. Private indulgences were kept from companions, and loyalty was tested at every turn. Women who had once been allies now found themselves observers of subtle betrayals, whispers exchanged behind curtains, and intimacies revealed only in fleeting, hallucinatory encounters. Margaret felt the sting of this betrayal personally when a confidant, whom she had trusted implicitly, revealed a secret indulgence that contradicted their shared code, shattering the fragile trust that had been cultivated over months of clandestine gatherings. Addiction, though, proved the most insidious force. What began as curiosity and experimentation gradually evolved into a reliance that was difficult to resist. The elixir, gentle at first, demanded increasing doses to produce the same effects, and its influence over mind and mood became pervasive. Women found themselves arranging their days around consumption, planning their social interactions according to when they might partake, and adjusting their behavior to maintain the delicate equilibrium of appearance and indulgence. Margaret, ever careful, noted the creeping dependency in herself, the desire for a single drop to calm anxiety, to sharpen thought, or to chase visions that now lingered beyond ordinary imagination. She recognized the signs of obsession, yet could not resist the temptation, drawn inexorably deeper into the drug's alluring labyrinth. Romantic entanglements took on new and dangerous dimensions. Women, intoxicated by the elixir's influence, formed attachments that defied societal norms and expectations. Some sought intimacy not for security or status, but for shared exploration, a communion of altered perception that was thrilling yet ephemeral. Others were drawn into secret liaisons with men whose understanding was partial at best, whose fascination bordered on exploitation, and whose ambitions could shatter fragile trust. Love, once guided by propriety and predictability, now existed, in a volatile, unpredictable state, magnified by the drug and complicated by secrecy, jealousy, and human desire. Margaret's own experiences mirrored this chaos. A painter of some repute, whose work she had admired at a gallery, became a focal point for her attention. Under the influence of the elixir, their conversations transcended ordinary acquaintance, flowing into realms of abstract thought, perception, and shared vision. Yet she sensed instability in the artist's devotion, a mercurial quality amplified by the intoxicating influence of the drug. Suspicion, Desire and admiration blended into a single, confusing tide, leaving her unable to disentangle genuine affection from chemical compulsion. Betrayal was further complicated by the presence of rival women within the secret society. Conflicts, subtle but sharp, arose over the allocation of the elixir, the sequencing of gatherings, and even the sharing of visions. Power, once defined by family, wealth, or social standing, now shifted according to insight, daring, and mastery of the drug's influence. Friendships fractured under the weight of secrecy and obsession, and those who resisted indulgence found themselves marginalized or coerced by those who had succumbed fully to the elixir's compelling allure. The addictive nature of the drug, however, was not limited to romantic or social spheres. Women began experiencing withdrawal in quiet, private moments, sudden anxiety, restlessness, and a gnawing sense of incompleteness that could only be quelled by another dose. The boundaries between indulgence and necessity blurred, and even the most disciplined struggled to maintain control. Margaret recognized these early signs in herself: the tightening of thought when she was separated from the elixir, the vivid hallucinations that now intruded into waking life, and the irresistible pull of the next dose. Through love, betrayal, and addiction, the societal consequences of the elixir became increasingly evident. Relationships shifted from stability to volatility. Trust, once foundational, was undermined by secrecy, and the once orderly rhythms of courtship and social interaction were replaced by impulses and compulsions shaped by chemical influence. Margaret, caught at the center of these currents, understood that the drug had not merely altered perception, it had remade the very landscape of desire, loyalty, and human connection. As the spring deepened, so too did the grip of the elixir. Love became a perilous pursuit, betrayal a constant threat, and addiction a shadow lurking behind every moment of pleasure. The ladies of society, empowered yet imperiled, were moving into uncharted territory, guided by curiosity, obsession, and the spectral allure of the drug. Margaret, poised between liberation and destruction, felt the first real tremors of irrevocable change. The world she had known, defined by etiquette, social expectation, and measured affection, was dissolving, replaced by a realm in which passion, secrecy, and chemical influence ruled, and in which no one, not even the most careful, could predict the outcome. By midsummer, the drug's influence had begun to manifest in ways that were far more disturbing than absence, addiction, or social disruption. The women of London, particularly those most deeply engaged in the secret society, began reporting experiences that defied explanation, visions that intruded unbidden, phantasms that lingered long after the effects of the elixir should have waned, and whispers of presence in empty rooms. Margaret Winthrop, once exhilarated by the breadth of perception the elixir offered, now found herself navigating a world increasingly haunted by shadows, both literal and psychological. The earliest manifestations were subtle: a flicker in the corner of the eye, a movement out of place, or the sensation that a room itself was breathing with unseen life. At first, Margaret dismissed these phenomena as residue of overindulgence or the product of imagination. Yet over time, the shadows grew more insistent, more tangible. They followed her through private chambers, whispered at the edges of her consciousness, and left a chill in their wake that no fire, no warmth of candlelight could dispel. She began to realize that the drug's influence was no longer limited to altered perception. It had begun to shape the very fabric of experience, intertwining reality with something unnameable, spectral, and often terrifying. These hauntings were not limited to Margaret. Letters, discreetly exchanged among the secret society, described similar occurrences. Objects moving seemingly of their own accord, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, and fleeting impressions of figures standing at thresholds before vanishing when observed directly. Women spoke of voices murmuring their names, of patterns forming in wallpaper and fabric that hinted at other presences, and of mirrors that reflected not their own features but unfamiliar, distorted visages. Some dismissed these occurrences as hallucination, while others accepted them as evidence that the elixir had pierced a veil, granting insight into dimensions normally hidden from human perception. Margaret's own encounters grew more vivid and alarming. On certain nights, she would awaken to find her chambers transformed. Walls that had been solid seemed porous, ceilings that had been low appeared impossibly high, and the familiar layout of furniture shifted with subtle dislocations that left her disoriented. Shadows moved against the light of her candles, sometimes forming vaguely humanoid shapes, other times suggesting landscapes impossible to reconcile with physical reality. These phantasms were neither overtly threatening nor benign. They were, instead, insistently present, demanding attention, and impossible to ignore. The women's shared experiences added another layer of complexity. Through letters and secret meetings, Margaret discovered that these shadows, while individually perceived, often overlapped in nature or timing. A whisper in one drawing room might correspond to a shadow glimpsed elsewhere. A pattern noticed by one member would recur in another's vision. The phenomenon suggested that the drug did more than alter individual consciousness. It created a subtle connectivity, linking participants' perceptions in a network that transcended physical space. The society, intended as sanctuary and exploration, now became a conduit for forces that could not be fully controlled or understood. The psychological impact was profound. Anxiety and sleeplessness became common among women who experienced repeated hauntings. Some reported the shadows speaking directly to their fears or desires, hinting at truths they were reluctant to acknowledge. Margaret, grappling with the dual exhilaration and terror of these visions, found herself increasingly isolated even within the society. The shared indulgence that had once bound members together now heightened vulnerability, as collective hallucinations amplified individual dread. Trust, already fragile, began to fray under the weight of unseen presences. Even the gentlemen of society noticed subtle changes, though they rarely recognized their source. A lady might seem distracted, conversing as if addressing someone unseen, or hesitate mid-step, eyes following a pattern imperceptible to others. The whispers and speculations that had circulated in drawing rooms deepened, now tinged with unease and fear. Families, oblivious to the secret society, struggled to account for the new dislocations in behavior, while physicians like Dr. Holloway documented increasingly erratic manifestations, acknowledging in private that the drug's influence had extended far beyond physical or social disruption. Margaret began to explore the haunting systematically, attempting to discern patterns, triggers, and relationships between visions and doses. She discovered that certain times of day, twilight, early dawn, intensified the phenomenon, and that prolonged abstinence could paradoxically bring shadows closer, as if the absence of the drug allowed the latent presence to assert itself more fully. Objects imbued with memory, family heirlooms, familiar furniture, seemed particularly susceptible, serving as focal points for spectral distortions that could range from fleeting impressions to vivid hallucinations that occupied the entirety of a room. The intensity of these experiences forced Margaret to confront her own psyche in ways that were uncomfortable and profound. She questioned her sanity, the reality of the world around her, and even the nature of identity itself. The elixir had promised freedom and heightened perception, yet its most enduring legacy was the expansion of consciousness into spaces where reality, memory, and shadow intertwined indistinguishably. In these moments, the distinction between waking and dreaming blurred, leaving her vulnerable to influence, suggestion, and the haunting presence of her own, and others' fears. The Theorem secret society, once a refuge, now functioned as a map for navigating the increasingly spectral landscape. Meetings focused not only on indulgence but on mutual support, strategies for distinguishing hallucination from reality, and collective interpretations of shared visions. Yet even these interventions could not fully mitigate the intensity of the hauntings, nor the slow erosion of certainty. Margaret realized, with a mixture of awe and terror, that the shadows were not merely phantasms, they were markers of a deeper change, a transformation in perception that the elixir had initiated and that no measure of caution or discretion could wholly reverse. By summer's end, the haunted state of these women had become a defining feature of their existence. Margaret, caught between fascination and fear, understood that the elixir had opened a doorway from which there might be no return. Shadows followed, whispered, and observed, and the very architecture of perception, space, time, identity, was being subtly rewritten. London's elite, unaware of the full extent of these transformations, continued its routines, oblivious to the spectral revolution quietly unfolding within the hearts, minds, and private chambers of its most privileged women. By late summer, the allure of the elixir had deepened into something more perilous than mere curiosity or social rebellion. For Margaret Winthrop and the other members of the secret society, the drug's effects had transformed from a controlled indulgence into a compulsion, an unrelenting force that demanded attention, altered behavior, and reshaped priorities. The once discreet gatherings, meant for exploration and shared experience, became arenas in which obsession and desire took precedence over friendship, propriety, and even safety. Margaret found herself waking before dawn, restless, compelled by an invisible force to prepare small doses of the elixir and to meticulously arrange her chambers for solitary ritual. The act of consumption was no longer merely pleasurable. It had become necessary, a subtle yet irresistible compulsion that governed her hours. Each experience drew her deeper into altered states of perception, extending the hallucinations, shadows, and whispers that had begun months earlier. What had once been moments of curiosity became days of altered consciousness, fragmented and intense, leaving her simultaneously exhilarated and hollow. Other women within the society were similarly ensnared. Some became entirely reclusive, abandoning social obligations, family duties, and public appearances in favor of repeated doses and extended periods of private exploration. Their physical health, while outwardly maintained, began to show subtle signs of strain, pallor, fatigue, and small tremors that physicians could not explain. The boundaries between addiction and transcendence blurred as women justified indulgence as a pursuit of insight, liberation, or heightened awareness. The elixir, once a tool for experimentation, had become an inescapable force. Margaret's obsession was intensified by the allure of the shadows and visions that persisted even when the drug's immediate effects waned. She became increasingly focused on decoding these phenomena, attempting to identify patterns, connections, and hidden meanings. Every flicker of movement, every whisper at the edge of perception, every distortion in the mirrored surface of her chamber became a puzzle, demanding attention. Sleep became erratic, consumed by vivid dreams that bled into waking reality, leaving her disoriented and yearning for the clarity the elixir seemed to provide. Romantic and social entanglements further fueled the descent. Relationships once guided by social decorum now existed in a state of flux and uncertainty, intensified by chemical influence. Margaret's fascination with the young artist had escalated into a near-obsessive preoccupation. Every encounter, every shared glance, every conversation became charged with meaning, overlaid with hallucination, suggestion, and desire. Jealousies and rivalries within the secret society compounded the effect, as women competed for influence, attention, or control over shared experiences. Friendships fractured, alliances shifted, and Margaret found herself both participant and observer in a drama that was at once intimate and dangerous. Isolation deepened the obsession. While society outside continued its rigid routines, Margaret increasingly withdrew into her private rituals. Letters went unanswered, social invitations declined, and even the secret gatherings became secondary to the personal, private indulgence of the drug. The boundaries between self and hallucination blurred, as shadows and visions began to inform behavior, thought, and decision-making. Margaret noted with growing unease that she could no longer distinguish between experiences prompted by the elixir and impulses that seemed to arise from her own mind. Every action, every decision, carried the weight of obsession, guided by chemical influence and the lure of altered perception. The descent was mirrored in physical manifestations. Her reflection became unfamiliar, her movements fluid, yet disjointed, her voice sometimes tinged with tones she did not recognize. Others in the society reported similar transformations. Subtle elongations of feature, shifts in posture, changes in the timbre of speech. These alterations, while not immediately alarming to outsiders, contributed to a growing internal awareness that the drug was not merely shaping thought and emotion, It was remolding identity itself. Margaret's own journal, once intended to record observations and experiences with clarity, became chaotic. Entries overlapped, sentences spiraled, and sketches of visions consumed entire pages. The act of writing, rather than grounding her, reflected and amplified the obsession. She recorded each hallucination, every whisper, every shadow. But the act of documentation only drew her deeper, reinforcing the compulsion and creating a feedback loop between perception, indulgence, and reflection. Even the support of the secret society, initially a stabilizing force, could not mitigate the intensity of the descent. Meetings became sessions of mutual reinforcement, where obsession was validated, amplified, and celebrated. Women compared visions, shared strategies for prolonging effects, and offered guidance on managing withdrawal, all while subtly competing for insight, influence, and mastery over the altered states. The society had become both refuge and enabler, a mirror reflecting the increasing depth of each member's entanglement with the elixir. Margaret recognized, with a mixture of pride and dread, that she had crossed a threshold. Curiosity had become dependence. Indulgence had become obsession. The drug's influence was no longer a temporary indulgence, but a defining element of consciousness, identity, and daily existence. Shadows and whispers had become constant companions, guiding perception, shaping thought, and altering emotion. The elixir had transformed from a tool of exploration into a master, subtle yet unyielding, and Margaret understood that the journey ahead promised both unparalleled insight and the perilous possibility of permanent unmooring from the world she once knew. As the nights deepened, so too did her compulsion. Each moment away from the elixir, each hour spent in ordinary society, felt incomplete, lacking, unreal. Margaret was ensnared, a participant in her own transformation, conscious of the descent yet powerless to resist its gravitational pull. The elixir, the society, the shadows, and the whispers had become inseparable, a constellation of forces guiding her toward an uncertain horizon, where liberation and destruction were intertwined, and where every choice carried the weight of profound consequence. By the onset of autumn, the consequences of the elixir had reached a tipping point. The women of the secret society, who had once disappeared only in glimpses and whispers, were now vanishing entirely from the familiar rhythms of London society. Margaret Winthrop, herself caught between curiosity, addiction, and terror, observed with growing dread as friends, confidants, and rivals alike slipped from drawing rooms, salons, and streets into realms no one could chart or understand. These were not mere absences. They were complete erasures of presence, leaving only letters, personal effects, and faint rumors as traces of lives once entwined with the social fabric of the city. The disappearances began gradually, though with an eerie predictability. A woman would fail to appear at a scheduled gathering, sending a brief note suggesting travel or illness. When she did not return, a second note would follow, more ambiguous, hinting at necessity, spiritual pursuit, or personal matters of consequence. Families, constrained by propriety and denial, often accepted these explanations at face value, though whispered fears persisted. Within the secret society, however, the disappearances were understood differently. They were the culmination of indulgence, obsession, and transformation. Women had moved beyond the bounds of ordinary perception, stepping into a liminal space that was simultaneously alluring and perilous. Margaret's own participation deepened. She had observed the stages: initial indulgence, escalating obsession, increasing intensity of visions, and finally, the disappearance of the self into a state of heightened, unanchored consciousness. As friends vanished one by one, she confronted the haunting question of her own trajectory. Would she, too, succumb fully? Or could she find a measure of control within the inexorable pull of the elixir? The tension was relentless, as every ritual, every dose, every shared experience nudged her closer to the threshold she could neither fully anticipate nor resist. The manifestations of the drug had grown increasingly dramatic. Shadows now appeared, with clarity and persistence, whispering and moving with purpose. Hallucinations overlapped with waking reality, creating a world where time, space, and identity were mutable. Some women reported stepping into landscapes that were entirely foreign, yet intimately familiar, traversing corridors of memory, dream, and perception simultaneously. Others described encounters with figures they could not name, beings who offered knowledge, judgment, or temptation. Margaret herself experienced episodes in which her body remained in her chambers while her consciousness drifted across impossible landscapes, interacting with others who were similarly untethered. Families, sensing the inevitability of loss, attempted intervention. Physicians like Dr. Holloway were consulted with increasing urgency, yet their remedies, reason, rest, restraint, proved powerless against a substance that reshaped mind, perception, and desire. Gentlemen, bewildered and alarmed, sought explanations, some even venturing to the secret gatherings in hopes of understanding. Yet the rituals, coded language, and shared hallucinations remained impenetrable to those who had not partaken. Society at large remained oblivious to the depth of the transformation, mistaking absence for illness, withdrawal for propriety, or disappearance for scandal. The final disappearances were marked by deliberate and coordinated withdrawal from the physical world. Women who had become fully enmeshed in the drug's effects took steps to sever ordinary obligations. Letters were carefully composed to explain absences, personal affairs arranged to avoid notice, and houses quietly emptied. Margaret observed the careful planning with awe and dread, noting how the elixir had not only altered consciousness, but instilled a meticulous, almost ritualistic method of exit. Each disappearance was both a personal liberation and a societal wound, leaving those left behind to speculate, gossip, and mourn. Margaret herself approached the brink. The elixir had taken root in every corner of her being. Her reflections, once familiar, now seemed like the image of another woman. Her perceptions were saturated with shadow, light, and whispering voices, her dreams indistinguishable from waking reality. Yet she hesitated, aware of the irreversible nature of the final step. Friends, some vanished entirely, some partially, were now phantoms of memory and perception, their presence felt only through echoes, letters, and the subtle imprint of shared experience. One evening, in the quiet aftermath of a society gathering, Margaret recorded her thoughts. Each disappearance is both an arrival and a departure. We step beyond the thresholds of comprehension, guided by desire, curiosity, and fear. The world we leave behind continues without pause, unaware of what has slipped away. I feel its call, its seduction, and I tremble at the thought of crossing it fully. Yet every fiber of my being leans toward the final step, where shadow and substance, dream and reality, dissolve into one. The last of the society's women departed in stages that were both orderly and haunting. Rooms once filled with music, laughter, and conversation became silent, untouched, as if the very air had absorbed the lives it had contained. Letters, journals, and small personal effects remained as fragile testimony to their existence, yet their owners had moved into a plane where ordinary perception could not follow. Margaret, standing at the threshold of this final transformation, recognized the culmination of months of indulgence, obsession, and haunting. The elixir had not simply altered consciousness, it had created a new state of being, one in which disappearance was not loss, but transformation. The city of London, oblivious to the profound exodus, continued its routines. The drawing rooms remained polite, the streets bustling, and society itself unbroken in appearance. Yet beneath the veneer of normalcy, the subtle presence of the vanished women lingered, a network of absence, memory, and whispered influence. The secret society had completed its metamorphosis, from curious indulgence to obsession, from addiction to disappearance, leaving behind a landscape that was both haunted and transformed, where the ordinary and the extraordinary intersected, and where Margaret, at the brink, faced the ultimate choice between the world she knew and the infinite unknown. The first frost of winter crept across London as Margaret Winthrop stood alone in her chamber, the faint scent of the elixir lingering in the air. Outside, the city moved in its habitual rhythm, indifferent to the transformations that had quietly unfolded in its midst. The secret society had dissipated, Its members vanished into realms of perception and experience that defied ordinary understanding. Margaret, poised at the threshold of the final step, understood that she was both witness and participant in a phenomenon that had transcended morality, society, and the limitations of the human mind. The room around her shimmered with the subtle distortions she had come to recognize. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, light bent at impossible angles, and surfaces reflected not reality, but memory, desire, and the echoes of vanished companions. She sensed them, her friends, once corporeal, now existing as presences intertwined with perception, untethered yet deeply familiar. The elixir had carried them beyond the confines of ordinary consciousness, creating a realm where identity, time, and space were mutable, and where the ordinary laws of cause and consequence no longer held sway. Margaret's own mind oscillated between clarity and dissolution. The elixir had sharpened her awareness even as it loosened her grip on material reality. She felt every heartbeat, every pulse of breath, as though her body were a fragile vessel for consciousness rather than its master. Memories of the society, the bee, whispered advice, shared visions, laughter and rivalry, love and betrayal, flooded her senses. They were both grounding and disorienting, a reminder of the human world she was leaving and the extraordinary existence she was approaching. With deliberate care, Margaret prepared her final ritual. She measured the elixir, aware that this would be the dose that carried her beyond the veil. Every movement was precise, ceremonial, and imbued with the significance of culmination. The room, once familiar, became a threshold space, suspended, between ordinary perception and the spectral dimension she had glimpsed in visions. Shadows writhed, whispers rose and fell like distant echoes, and the air thrummed with a quiet intensity, as if the universe itself paused in anticipation. The first sip brought the familiar warmth, followed by the gentle expansion of perception that she had experienced countless times before. Yet this time, it carried a sense of finality, a sense that the ordinary world was receding, not merely in observation, but in reality. Walls, ceiling, and floor dissolved into a luminous haze, a space where forms and figures coexisted across layers of time and memory. Margaret saw her vanished companions, some translucent, some fully radiant, moving with purpose and grace, beckoning her toward a horizon that was both comforting and terrifying. Every step into this altered state amplified the interconnection she had felt with the others. Perception became collective, thought and emotion intertwined, producing insight and understanding that transcended individual consciousness. Margaret glimpsed patterns in the world, invisible to those who remained tethered to ordinary experience. The hidden geometries of human interaction, the subtle currents of desire and fear, and the ineffable structures of memory and identity. In this realm, past, present, and future coexisted, creating a continuum in which ordinary distinction became meaningless. Yet the descent was not without shadow. The elixir demanded surrender, and surrender required courage. Margaret felt the tug of corporeal existence, the pull of family, society, and the known world. She remembered love, betrayal, and obsession, and the lingering weight of attachment threatened to anchor her. But the whispers of the vanished, the rhythmic pulse of shared consciousness, and the luminous possibilities beyond the veil guided her onward. She understood that crossing fully meant relinquishing the ordinary, but also gaining a form of understanding, freedom, and connection impossible in the confines of everyday life. Margaret's final act was both deliberate and instinctive. She closed her eyes, allowed the elixir to fully permeate her senses, and stepped into the flow of perception, leaving behind the chamber, the city, and the world of conventional reality. Light, shadow, sound, and thought merged. The boundaries of self dissolved, and she became part of a continuum in which all vanished women of the society existed, connected through insight, shared experience, and the transformative power of the elixir. There was no fear, no pain, no absence, only a profound awareness, a luminous eternal presence that transcended mortality and human limitation. London, oblivious, continued its routines. The drawing rooms remained polite, the streets vibrant, with daily activity, and society preserved its outward composure. Yet the elite women who had once inhabited these spaces were now beyond reach, their influence subtle and ethereal, their presence folded into perception, memory, and the hidden architectures of consciousness. Margaret, having crossed the threshold, existed in a state neither dream nor waking life, but something beyond, a luminous echo, a participant in a reality simultaneously internal and universal. The elixir had claimed its final act, not as destruction, but as transformation. The ladies of Victorian society, once bound by propriety, expectation, and limitation, had transcended. And Margaret, poised beyond the veil, became both observer and participant, a testament to the intoxicating, terrifying, and ultimately liberating power of curiosity, desire, and the unknown. The shadows whispered no longer. They had become light, insight, and presence, eternal in the dimensions opened by a single, extraordinary substance.